I'm not fully convinced morality is subjective, I'll be honest. I'm having some second thoughts about it. I think
Neither am I.
I think that, well, that's why it's an interesting topic, because
Yes.
I feel compelled to believe this part of the argument for objective morality, which is by breaking down every decision making based on a moral standard, the final goal is always tied to well-being. But at the same time, I feel that there may be a component, a subjective component, that has to do with what every single individual believes to be right or wrong. So for objective morality, thought exercise sometimes is postulated is slavery in the U.S. 100 years ago. Was it moral then to enslave people, and now it is no longer moral? Or is it that it was always immoral to own people as property, and at that time we didn't know? Not me, not you, but people didn't know.
Right.
And that's the main distinction. A moral subjectivist would say it was then right, it was then moral, and now it is immoral. A moral objectivist would say it was always immoral. Why? Because it always decreased net well-being.
Right.
What I find compelling about that objective morality argument is that, in part, and this is sort of a fallacy, it feels more comfortable to me to be able to say slavery was always wrong. It's just that at that time people were not convinced about it. But it's not that it was wrong. So if you could go back in time to that point, if you were to be born at that time, very likely you were going to say, very likely, maybe not, but you were likely going to say it was moral to own people as property. But if you were to take yourself of the present to that moment in the past, you would probably say what you're saying now. You would consider it immoral, even though everyone else around you considers it moral.
Sure.
Because of that, I tend to think a little bit more along the lines of moral objectivity.
Right. Well, I mean, the way I am sort of imagining it as you speak is to see sort of a thermodynamic scenario where you have two flasks. One has all of the air in it, and the other one has no air in it. It's a vacuum, and they're connected by a valve.
Yeah.
You open the valve. Entropy is the sort of thermodynamic principle through which the gas moves from one valve to another, so that they have equal volume of gas. And that will happen. It seems to be a principle of the universe that entropy drives the formation of a sort of equilibrium and the reduction of forces. And when you have a slavery situation, you have one group of people who is sort of holding all of the negative emotion. They're being oppressed. They're subverting their will. They're not able to actualize themselves. You have one group who is sort of profiting from that, and they gain some positive emotion. But the unequal distribution of misery is naturally diffused through social change. It seems to be a force that drives the way that society progresses. Society tends to be moving in the direction of becoming more moral.
That's a fascinating argument I haven't heard. Maybe it's somewhere, I don't know. But I think it's very descriptive. And it does make sense to me,
Mm.
at least as a metaphor or
Yeah,
allegoric sort of.
sure. I mean, there's no reason to say that human emotions and social dynamics operate on entropy, right? But maybe,
But what is interesting is that you have this theory, and if we look back to multiple situations in the history of humanity, there are many examples in which something like what you described did happen.
mm,
That doesn't necessarily mean that from now on in the future that will be the natural course of things. I think it's interesting that you mention entropy because sometimes with social changes and equality,
mm,
it does feel a little bit like a dynamic process in which there is an overall movement forward.
mm,
And when I say forward, I mean towards well-being, overall well-being,
yeah,
that is sometimes taken backwards.
yes,
A good example,
yeah,
recent. So you would say, okay, the U.S. for many years has preserved the right of women to their own bodily autonomy through the legalization of abortion, but very recently we have in Georgia a bill that takes that back.
yes,
So, and there are many examples of this kind of regressions to prior moral standards.
yes,
But I like to think that is so. If you take a picture of that
mm,
and you only observe that, you could say, okay, we are going backwards on morality.
right,
But if you look at the overall picture, maybe through history, we have movements forward and backward,
mm-hmm.
but that overall, the net result of those movements is forward. And that is an optimistic, nice way to see things that correlates with reality. It's not just that it feels good. I think it is consistent with what we can observe so far.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an assumption, this is a leap in the argument, but it could be argued, not with complete certainty, that this will continue to be the case, such as every day the sun has risen, and we can confidently assume it will do the same thing tomorrow. Well, or the Earth rotated more accurately, that it will happen again tomorrow. It is a very likely a scenario. We still cannot take the full certainty that it will. It may be that it did so far and it will stop doing so starting tomorrow.
It could happen.
It could, but that's how we operate. We operate based on premises that have been proven to be correct so far,
Mm-hmm.
and we tend to assume past behavior is a good predictor of future behavior. But that's it, a predictor is not necessarily an absolute certainty. It's not future reading. But with social change, I think it would be reasonable to think that the overall direction societies will take in the world is in that direction. Again, always with a mismatch between different places. We still have women being stoned to death in certain parts of the world, but overall, I think there is movement forward, and it is reasonable to think it will continue in that direction. Even though it may be slower than we would like it to, or that we will be able to notice ourselves.
The abortion thing is interesting because it's not a step back on the same line as a return to slavery would be a step back. If we return to slavery, we re-enter a situation where there's a one group taking advantage of another, and there's a sequestration of negative experience in the group that's being dominated.
I feel it is exactly the same phenomenon with abortion rights.
No, explain that, because I don't
Please.
quite see it.
Oh, you want me to explain? So, bodily autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
in the example of a government legislating on what women can do with their own bodies,
Mm-hmm.
is a step back, first of all, in the right to bodily autonomy. And in that regard, what it's a step back in their freedom. Any anti-abortion person may argue, why don't you see it as a step forward for fetuses, right?
Right.
And I would say, first of all, there's an unavoidable issue of whether we consider every form of human products and byproducts as equally deserving of the same rights. We have some very strict very clear limits we all agree on. For instance, we tend to believe that dead people have lost certain rights they had when they were alive.
Right.
That's sort of a clear cut-off point.
Yep.
But in the other extreme of the life cycle, possibly we will all agree that germinal cells, ovi, and spermatozoa would not be subject to the same human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, I don't know if everyone, but most people may agree with that. But from then on, through the process of fecundation, conception, implantation, and pregnancy overall, there are different cut-off points defended by different people on when that biological being becomes deserving of certain rights.
Right.
This, for instance, this bill in Georgia
Mm-hmm.
creates a pretty arbitrary cutoff point,
Yes.
which is fetal heartbeat.
Yep.
That is the beginning of human rights, according to this bill.
Okay.
So, as basically because it essentially says, until that point, a woman has the right to. Well, this is kind of tricky because fetal heartbeat starts being detectable at around 6 weeks on average.
Right. Sounds right.
And usually women get to know they are pregnant, if not at that point, even a little later. Basically depending on how regular their periods are.
Mm-hmm.
So if it is irregular, it is very likely, and they usually have over 6 weeks cycles,
Mm-hmm.
it is likely they will miss it.
Yes, they will be unaware of the fact that they're pregnant until it's too late. According
According to this law, in which what this bill does is provide full personhood to that fetus.
Yep.
And the thing is, and what does that mean? Having full personhood, that anything the pregnant woman does that ends up in the death of that fetus is the equivalent, the legal equivalent
of murder.
of murder,
Yeah.
which in the specific state of Georgia, it would have
Life in prison or death penalty.
or death penalty, Then you have a middle ground in which, for instance, if they go to a doctor who does practices an abortion, the doctor would be liable for life in prison or death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman would be charged with second degree murder, which is the penalty is around 30 years in prison. And if she tries to go to if she's caught going to get an abortion, she goes outside of the state to get an abortion, she could be charged with 10 years in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And last, if she has a miscarriage, it would perfectly fit the picture of manslaughter.
Yep.
And unintentional murder.
Right.
So, in a practical sense, that creates, for a pregnant woman with an undesired pregnancy, whether it comes from consensual sex or rape, non-consensual sex,
Mm-hmm.
the available legal options are keeping an unwanted pregnancy versus, if she self-provokes the abortion, life in prison or death penalty, versus the other options we said before, second degree murder. And this would force also the legal system it would warrant investigation every time a woman has a miscarriage, because there's no way to know how intentional that miscarriage was. Is it manslaughter, or is it a natural process of miscarriage, which can happen in up to, I think it's around 1/4 of pregnant women having a spontaneous abortion or miscarriage.
So this new bill creates a variety of problems and dramatically increases the complexity of becoming pregnant.
Not only that, also it creates the moral dilemma of I don't remember the number of how many pregnant women are currently imprisoned,
Mm-hmm.
and their fetuses are incarcerated. If they have full personhood,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't have the right to any sort of defense, and they are being incarcerated for a crime they didn't commit.
Mm-hmm.
They would deserve a lawyer to defend them.
Right.
Because they're people.
Right.
Why would you do something different than what you would do with a person? Well, one answer would be because it's ridiculous to hire a lawyer for a fetus. How would the fetus afford that? You could have a public defender, but what I'm saying is, besides all those intrinsic complexities that it creates, as you said, I have many reasons to believe that the overall level of well-being goes to hell with something like this. And if we base morality on well-being, as we were discussing at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
that necessarily means that something like this is intrinsically immoral.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Because of the violation of bodily autonomy, first and foremost, the unwarranted removal of freedom, and the overall increase in suffering.
So we may be approaching a general principle, which is that, in general, restraints on liberty tend to make people unhappy, and the exercise of liberty, the ability to follow your own sense of direction, make your own decisions, use all of the tools that are available in the environment to your benefit, including the ability to have an abortion, that liberty increases well-being, and infringing upon liberties reduces well-being.
Well, I wouldn't make a generalization out of it.
Mm-hmm.
From the liberal perspective, I tend to think that the baseline should be full freedom,
Mm-hmm.
and the limitations to that freedom should be justified with very good reasons. And that reason should not be a random reason, but proving that allowing the natural course of that freedom exercise overall decreases well-being. Sure. For instance,
sure.
Why wouldn't I be allowed to have the freedom of torturing, raping, and murdering people?
Right.
Well, because it would necessarily, so the exercise of that freedom, of that free action, would necessarily cause a very significant level of suffering and decrease in overall well-being
for the victims.
Yeah, and that's how we come up with social contracts.
Yes, I agree.
So so a liberal perspective on social contracts is we will allow anything unless that something increases suffering and decreases others' well-being. Or, furthermore, if you want to stay within the freedom realm, it interferes significantly with the freedom of others. And because it's a social contract, we are not just only concerned with every individual well-being, we are concerned about overall well-being, because we are a society, we are in a world in which we are stuck with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, in this case, we have the situation that a pregnant woman wants to exercise the freedom of terminating a pregnancy.
Yes.
I haven't been presented with any good reason so far on how that the net result of that act of freedom would reduce well-being, overall well-being.
Right. Okay. So, beautifully said. It sounds like when we create laws, we create social contracts about what behaviors are allowed versus not allowed.
Mm-hmm.
There is some sort of calculation about whether or not allowing the behavior will result in an overall increase, an increase in net unhappiness, net suffering. And so you're willing to create individual suffering in the limitation of liberties if the overall benefit is a net positive or a net gain
for restricting that freedom,
in well-being. Then the question is raised, why is it that we restrict the rights to abortion? And I think it's because if you assume that the fetus has personhood, then the act of abortion is the woman exercising her liberty at the expense of the fetus's right to life, and it becomes an act of cruelty and an act of murder.
That's an interesting point, because then I go one step further.
Right.
I haven't been convinced from anyone on exactly when personhood starts.
Sure.
This bill says when heartbeat starts. That sounds very, very arbitrary. Why wouldn't it be when the nervous system is developed, which happens later, up to a certain point in which pain and suffering can be experienced? But okay, it goes a little bit backwards, but that's fine. Let's assume that from the moment of conception, personhood starts.
We could.
Even if I assume that, I would still come to the same conclusion on why it's not immoral to have an abortion.
Right. I agree with you. I think that if we look at it in terms of the analysis that you laid out, which is we do an evaluation of whether or not the net well-being is increased.
Not only that,
decreased.
sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
Not only that, because I didn't present this yet, we discussed at some point in the past about it, but you mentioned the right to live, so we agreed that if, starting from conception, we grant a right to live, we should protect that right.
Okay.
Because personhood would carry the right to live.
Right.
That being the case, what is an abortion? Some people, and this is misleading, some people misleadingly say that an abortion is killing. The main goal is killing a fetus. When the main goal of abortion is terminating a pregnancy, and it's not just semantics. It can be proven when a woman in a late pregnancy, let's say third trimester, either has an unwanted pregnancy or let's say her life is at risk from that pregnancy and that pregnancy has to be terminated, or the fetus's life is at risk from continuing that pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is that labor is induced, either through induced labor or a C-section, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
In late pregnancy, in third trimester terminations of pregnancy, it is perfectly possible that the fetus makes it alive. And that when it makes it alive, it still receives, and that's current medical practice, it still receives all the neonatal care that any delivered baby would receive. If it makes it, the same process that goes for any woman who delivered a baby goes on, which is you either take parental responsibility for that kid or you refuse that responsibility by giving it up to adoption.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, so that's for late term. Before then, it is clear that the most likely scenario of terminating a pregnancy is the disease, the demise of the fetus or embryo if it is early enough. So the logical consequence of terminating that pregnancy, which is terminating the biological support that fetus/embryo is receiving from the mother, very likely will end up, if not absolutely likely, will end up in the demise of the product of conception. So that being the case, why I sometimes call anti-abortion people fetal supremacists is because what you are basically saying is, okay, we will grant this person, which is the fetus/embryo, we already agreed it is a person, a right we do not provide to any born person, which is not just the right to live, which if it is a late enough pregnancy, you're terminating, you will grant, and that's what happens. You will give neonatal care and do everything possible to make the baby live. What you want, if you're going to regulate women's bodies and force them to continue that support, even if they don't want to, giving that support, is a right that same fetus will lose as soon as it's born. Sure. Why? Because you will never force, let's say, a biological parent, either mother or father, to donate any form of support, either through blood, through a transplant, through any dangerous procedure. Sustaining a pregnancy, we agree, is a dangerous situation.
Sure.
Could end up very badly with a sky-high blood pressure that kills both the mother and the child. So you would not force a parent to get into a building in flames to take their children out of danger. You would not force a father, for instance, to donate a kidney even if it's the only chance for survival for that kid to live.
Mm-hmm.
And it is its son. So sometimes the argument is, okay, at the time you decided, or not decide, at the time you are biologically tied to that fetus, you have the obligation, the moral obligation, and the legal obligation of supporting the life of that fetus, no matter what that does to your health and well-being. But as soon as it's born, no one is forced to that. So for me, the only consistent way to defend a government forcing a woman to sustain a pregnancy, either through imprisonment or death penalty, whatever it is, is to then continue that same legal right for everyone who is born. Because otherwise you would have to explain me, why would you remove that right as soon as the fetus is born? Why would you grant the fetus a super right?
Mm-hmm. Point taken. So I think it's a wonderful argument. It clearly lays out the fact that there's an inconsistency, sort of troubling inconsistency in the rights that are assigned to fetuses versus living people. And it doesn't make sense why we would give the fetus those extra privileges that we don't give to people. And you know, so that's one reason why it's a little bit cognitively dissonant and to sort of say restrict abortion rights. And it's also, as we said before, there's a sense in which restricting a woman's right to have an abortion ends up causing more unhappiness than you would have if you just allowed that liberty to occur.
Particularly, sorry, just one side point, particularly if you who are forcing that woman to keep that pregnancy are not willing to, once the baby is born, do everything you could do to guarantee that prior fetus and now born person will have a life worth living. Because the reality is that many women forced to deliver a baby may be delivering a person who will be utterly unhappy.
Fair enough. Okay. And I guess, you know, the thing that I would want to sort of ask you about is, you know, the fact that these arguments are unlikely to actually have an impact on somebody who believes that life starts at conception, that a fetus is a person, and who sees the act of abortion as an act of murder, as an act of cruelty. And so we get into this debate about where life starts: conception, at the development of a nervous system, at the development of a notochord, cardiovascular system, whatever it is. Maybe it's whenever you have a migrated thyroid or something like that. It
Could be anything.
So we're in a position where we have to create an arbitrary cutoff. All of those arguments disappear, though, under a materialist view of life, which basically says that the egg and the sperm are physical matter that developed within a complicated system, the organism, and from a material perspective, it's just a being, an organism. The embryo itself is just a mechanical process. It's very beautiful. I don't know if I ever told you this, but I spent a lot of time looking at embryos under the microscope, studying embryology, and it's captivating to watch a fertilized frog embryo go into a tadpole and then develop into a frog. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful things that a person can see. But it doesn't change the fact that it is all material, and at the end of the day, you know, what life is a
continuum.
It's a continuum across time, and so the debate of when life starts is actually pointless. Life was there before conception,
Mhm.
it continued at conception, it continued at development of cardiovascular system and the nervous system, and beyond. But
Yeah, but I don't think the debate is when life starts, because we do have very good evidence that even an unfertilized egg is already alive. It's
that's what I'm
already
saying.
a living cell.
Yes.
But the debate goes into, okay, we all agreed that egg, it would create a lot of contradictions to say that egg or that single sperm, it's already a person, right?
But that's the thing, is personhood under this model is an illusion. Because there is no such thing really as
Because
an
it's a
individual.
social concept.
Yes.
So we are trying to tie a social concept to a biological process.
And in the biological sense, there really is no individuality. I mean,
Well,
in a material sense, there is no individuality. It's a process.
yes, I understand the point. I
Yes.
think it's fascinating and could take us to many other places. But before leaving this point, what I would say is, if someone asks me, when does personhood start in this continuum? I would say, I don't know. Some people say it is starting on conception, that personhood starts.
Mm-hmm.
Some people would say when the cardiovascular system develops, as this bill would discuss. Some people would say when the perception of pain is biologically possible,
Mm-hmm.
because being able to feel pain is what makes people be persons. I would then argue in very specific cases, neurological diseases in which the perception of pain may be completely obliterated.
Right.
Does that make you stop being a person?
Right,
So
right,
then,
right.
with that reductio ad absurdum, you would come to the conclusion, okay, maybe perception of pain is not a great argument for personhood. But whatever that is, so if we don't know, we still have situations in which women have unwanted pregnancies, and we have to legislate on that. We have to make a decision. And we will not be able to justify the decision with the solving of that dilemma, because we don't know yet. We may never know.
Well, I feel like I do know.
When does a biological human becomes also not just biology but also a person?
Never.
That's your argument.
Yeah.
So how do you legislate based on that?
Right. And so
It would be anarchy. We're all sets of cells, tissues, and organs that will do as much as they can do in this environment they end up sharing, and that's the end of it. But then someone would say, okay, don't you want to try to organize this a little bit further? Sure. So what I would say is, if we don't know, why don't we give the personhood claim the benefit of the doubt? I wouldn't go as far back as to say a sperm is a person, because that would mean that every time we masturbate, we are committing genocide.
Yep.
But maybe, okay, let's start in conception. Because when you have conception, it is true that the natural, not always, as 1/4 of the times it will end up in a miscarriage, but in many, we're all here because of that process. So I would agree, okay, there is the likelihoodness of that process culminating in what we all agree it's a person. Maybe not you, because you would say there's never personhood. And okay, that depends on what scheme you use. But what I say is, what most people would agree is a person. So eventually, when it's 20 years old, most people would say it's a person, even if it's a jackass. So what I'm saying is, let's assume personhood starts at conception, and let's differentiate the right to live from the right to live at the expense of other human being. And then you have the violinist argument, in which if you wake up wired or connected with a violinist who needs you to continue giving that support, not getting out of that room for 9 months in order to survive,
Right.
whether it would be murder for you to remove the connection and go on with your life. And it may not be. So what I don't like about that argument is that it's a little bit of so it's very unlikely that something like that happens. That's why I find the argument of the transplant more compelling, because that happens. So we have many examples of children who are born, and the only way for them to continue living
Yep.
is for a biological relative
Mm-hmm.
to donate either tissue or an organ.
Right.
That happens. We know it happens.
Like an anaplastic kidney.
Yeah, for instance.
Yeah.
So, unless we also force those biological relatives to give up their bodily autonomy
Yep.
to sustain the life of that child,
Mm-hmm.
there is no reason to only do that, to only force, in this case, women to give up their bodily autonomy to maintain a pregnancy.
So I agree with you that going ahead and establishing a moment of personhood is useful because it allows you to go on and create policies, and the policies are useful because they guide behavior in a way that maximizes well-being. But I am still convinced that there may be some utility in taking the view that life is simply a continuum, a materialist perspective. And the thing that you said was that we would run into some sort of anarchy if we were to sort of view personhood as an illusion.
Not necessarily. I mean, if that's the only so if the only scheme we use to figure out shit is that one, there would be no reasonable argument to regulate, organize, or legislate absolutely anything.
Mm.
If we do not come to the agreement, even if it's an operational agreement,
I disagree with you.
how would you? So, if we assume that that personhood is an illusory concept, not tied to reality of the natural world, it is a social construct, personhood, that doesn't. And again, I can agree up to a certain point that it will always be arbitrary. But what I'm saying is, if that's the only reference we'll use, what reason could you find to regulate other people's behavior
Mm-hmm.
if, first of all, they're not people?
Right.
They're biological beings
Mm-hmm.
in a material
Milieu.
universe.
Yeah.
Yes. And you're also determinist. If we also include that, which are only doing the only thing they could be doing.
Mm-hmm. So I guess what you could say is
Mhm.
that we appreciate the fact that life is a continuum. You and I are very, very closely related. We're
Yeah.
basically the same thing, more or less, from a biological perspective, an evolutionary perspective. And there's a lot of nice things about that. You feel a certain brotherhood with the universe as a result of looking at things from an evolutionary perspective.
But brotherhood itself is not a naturalistic concept.
No, and that's okay.
It's completely psychological and social construct.
Sure.
Brotherhood.
Yeah. So, but I guess that's kind of the point. Is that
But you need that, at least. At the very least, you need some construct that goes beyond naturalism in order to come to a conclusion like, okay, because of this, behaving like this would be better than behaving like that. I'm asking you, without getting out of the naturalistic
Yeah.
argument,
Mm-hmm.
which I share
Yes.
up to a certain point, how would you come up with any sort of prescriptive concept and going back to morality, what is better than what?
Right. So even if we take this sort of view that life is a continuum and materially it's all connected, and there really is no individuation from a biological perspective, it's just sort of a layer that we have imposed upon it based on sort of the way that our minds function, we have to admit that the continuum is globular. It is sequestered into objects that are separated through space, as in you and me and all the other individuals in the world of every species.
Yes.
And so that segregation allows for the phenomena that we were talking about before, which is sort of the internal conflict within each separate globule. And the system itself still experiences the individual globules do experience pain, and when the individual experiences pain, the system itself is disrupted. We have that effect on one another. The negative experience of one will eventually create a scenario in which suffering sort of disseminates, spreads, disperses, and so we're trying to create still a situation in which these globules are more or less equal and able to sort of occupy any spot in the petri dish and have the same overall level of well-being.
Why would that be desirable?
Yeah, and there's no reason. Ultimately, it becomes sort of like you get to a point where you have to say, the process is occurring, life has been evolving, it's really interesting. There's no reason to want it to stop, necessarily. In fact, it seems interesting enough that maybe it's worth doing things to help it. And to the extent that we have the ability to create a system that is fair and just and pleasant to be in, maybe we ought to be doing that.
Yes.
Yeah. And as you say, it seems to be a built-in property of the globules to want to achieve well-being and to tend towards well-being.
The question is it better to just wait for that to happen on itself, or would it be better to do anything among our possibilities to make that process that hopefully is only going in that direction, or overall the net direction goes towards that final, maybe unachievable point of maximization of well-being.
Right.
Would it be better to just let it happen, or would it be better to work towards that happening? And if you are, I think you're gonna say, yeah, it's better to work towards that.
We are strategic,
Yes.
and that is sort of one of our natural capacities. Yeah. And the question is, what is the most strategic way to go about it? I feel like you're going to say the most strategic way to go about it is to create, create policies or create ideology even that promotes the outcome that you want to see.
Or have this kind of debate and discussions to, again, before you mentioned, it is unlikely that someone who already has these strong thoughts about abortion being immoral, no matter the circumstance, it is unlikely by hearing these reasons or arguments, it will change. They will change their mind. We don't know, I would say. I do acknowledge the possibility of that happening. Otherwise, honestly, I would shut up my mouth. If I believe that there's zero chance of anyone changing belief. Why I have that assumption it is possible? Well, because I've seen myself and other people doing that.
Yes.
Hearing good arguments and changing their minds.
Yes.
I've seen it.
Yes.
Does it mean it will necessarily happen with every single time I interact with someone and have this type of discussion? Well, no, that's also false, but it may happen, and that's the main motivation for me to sort of like figure out better ways of thinking stuff. And what I think is, again, you would agree that, for instance, a return to formal slavery
Mm-hmm.
would go against this naturally occurring process of optimization of well-being in the long run. I can only think it is exactly the same thing with the Georgia bill. For instance, and
You convinced me of that.
there are so many other issues. I know it's not the only issue, but it's recent. It's struck me hard because I think that ultimately it is a good example of how certain achievements
Mm-hmm.
that were conquered at certain points in history can go backwards sometimes.
Yeah.
I hope it doesn't also happen with the slavery,
Mm.
but it is happening with this single issue.
Right.
And I don't know what is the potential, probably not a huge one, but what is the potential of having these conversations and hoping for people who would celebrate something like this to stop celebrating it and doing something more similar to what I do when something like this happens. But hey, up to a certain point it's possible, at least based on my past experience. Again, I cannot have the full certainty that something I observed in the past will necessarily happen again in the future,
Sure.
like the sun rising, but I feel confident enough that it could happen. And again, otherwise I wouldn't even mention it. I would assume, okay, this is how I feel and what I think about it. I'll leave everyone with their own thoughts and feelings about it.
I'm very grateful that you have invited me to participate with you and collaborate with you on these topics, and I'm looking forward to hopefully doing a lot more of it. It's very, very fun.
It is mutual collaboration. I loved it. Hopefully, I don't know, it keeps going.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure.
It has. Should we shake hands?
Yes. Why not? Why the fuck not?
I can't wait till we get our pipes.
Yes, please. Man.